to Globespan. I am Paul Hennessy of Guyana. Accompanying me tonight is my co-host, Professor Floyd Haynes, a businessman and Guyanese. He's also the president of the Roraima Institute, a Guyanese think tank. I also have today with us Dr. Desmond Thomas. He is on the executive of the Electoral Reform Group that is addressing the issue of electoral reform in Guyana. He is also an author of a book about electoral reform, and he has a history of being a professor in various countries. He's worked here in Washington, D.C., in the Inter-American Development Bank, and so forth. Now he's residing in Guyana. We're so happy to have him. And we also have Mr. Vincent Alexander, well-known politician and one of the most controversial figures during the last elections. I hope he smiles at my introduction. A Guyanese politician, seasoned Guyanese politician. We also have with us Mr. Timothy Juniors, senior counsel and the leader of the New and United Guyana Party. So these are our guests this evening, and the subject we are dealing with is national healing. We started that discussion in the last program we did, and we intend to continue focusing on the national healing issue in Guyana. We also are going to look at GECOM and the upcoming local government election, which supposedly is supposed to be in November of 2021. But before we start a discussion among the guests, I would like to play a recent speech, just an extract of a recent speech made by His Excellency Dr. Irfan Ali in Buxton regarding peace and unity.
Brothers and sisters, Buxton is no strange place to me. When I started my career at the Ministry of Finance, I know many of the younger folks might not know, but I used to be in this village almost twice every month with one Thai group chant. For a matter of fact, Iron Man was my partner. And if you go in his shop, I don't know, I see the shop is still there, you will see that there is a domino trophy there. And that domino trophy was won by us in Buxton back then. So, community involvement is part of my life. I addressed Parliament a few days ago, and I spoke about creating a oneness. And I thought about this over the last week. And I asked myself, where can we create a pilot program to demonstrate to Guyana that oneness that we want to create? To demonstrate to Guyana that we have the ability to come together, to work together in a peaceful manner. And I said, and today we are putting this behind us because we are moving in one direction forward. But I said, where give this multifaceted example? And a corridor came to my mind. Because of historical reasons, challenges, the corridor of Luziknan, Enterprise, Buxton, Annadale, Falls, Enmore, and Golden Grove came to my mind. And this will be the pilot program. We are going to create this corridor as the corridor of unity, the corridor that will demonstrate to Guyana how communities are going to come together, how communities are going to fuse themselves together and show that we have it in us. We have the ability to create this one Guyana, this one destination for every single one of us, every single one.
So thank you very much, Devin, for playing that introduction. Now I'd like to for us to begin the discussion. Dr. Thomas, what is your reaction to what you just heard?
Thank you, Paul. I'm comfortable with Desmond Thomas. Just Desmond is fine. Thank you for this opportunity to participate in this discussion, and really happy to be in this discussion with the group that you assembled here. I'm encouraged by the sentiments expressed in that clip. At least we're at a point where it suggests that everybody is aware that we have to come together. We have to at least make some attempt to overcome our differences and divisions. So at least we are, there are not a lot of things that we agree about in this country. But I think we are at a point now where there is widespread agreement that we need to work towards harmony in all kinds, in different directions. So the question, therefore, is what do we do about it? But at least we're making a start. We're recognizing that we have to come together. I think that it's good too that the politicians are actually making those songs. It is therefore, what's important though is to see the space that is given for ordinary citizens to have a role, to have to play a part in this process, because that is what's been missing in the past, is the kind of civil society input. And so it's going to be important to see what happens in that direction. And that is what I want to see, how that plays out. It's good to have good intentions, but a lot depends on the specifics of the measures that are going to be taken.
Okay, Mr. Alexander, what is your reaction to the clip you just saw?
I am of the view that what the clip represents is an articulated acceptance that we have a problem. I think that is the one thing, and in a sense, I am agreeing with Desmond. Recent pronouncements, whether intentional or otherwise, have represented an articulated acceptance that there is a problem to be solved, that there is disunity, therefore there is a need to work towards unity. One really has to see what unfolds in terms of an attempt to address that problem. Beyond that articulation and that apparent acceptance that there is a problem, I really am not yet aware of what really is intended to be done to deal with the problem. And more importantly, I am not aware that we have openly addressed the question of causation of the problem, because I feel unless the question of causation is addressed, then we're not likely to have solutions to the problem. You have to be able to identify what caused something so that your solutions are focused on those causal factors. And so I think that the next challenge is, if we are serious about the apparent acceptance of the problem, is to address the causal factors as the basis for then finding solutions to the problem.
Timothy, what is your initial reaction to the clip we just showed?
I've said before that I believe President Ali has the best intention, and every leader of Guyana loves Guyana, despite the problems that Guyana has. So every leader will say exactly what President Ali said about the wish for unity, the need for unity, and the determination to achieve unity. And most leaders will then fall into the first political trap of making the false claim that their party represents all Guyanese. And I think that that may be the first stumbling block, by not acknowledging the reality. um, when you look in the mirror, you immediately will fail in trying to find solutions when you look outside at others. So the sentiments expressed are sentiments that I believe are genuinely held by the president, and we have to see what actions take place in the future, which will either vindicate those sentiments or show us that nothing really has changed.
Floyd, would you like to pose any questions to our guests regarding their reaction to Ali's, President Ali's clip?
Yes, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Vincent, and thanks, Dr. Thomas, and welcome back, Tim. I would start at a little bit more fundamental place than Vincent. So, in other words, Vincent says we should look or study causation. In order to solve the problem, we must determine or identify the root cause, and that has not been done. Well, I would start a little ahead of that, or in front of that. I think we first have to define the problem. I'm not so sure we all see the problem the same way. And unless we can define a problem, we would be arguing all day about what the solution is. So I would first like to ask Vincent to articulate the problem as he sees it. And then as a follow-up, this issue of finding causation and those types of things have been around for quite some time. And Vincent, your party has had a chance to address it. And I would be curious to hear why you think they haven't addressed it and why it's so fresh in your mind today.
Let me start off by saying that I have repeatedly to publicly indicate that no party should be ascribed as my party. Okay. That I am a former member of the People's National Congress Reform who has not been in party membership since 2007. So that I do not speak for and I'm not a member of the party.
Accepted.
I do agree with your contention that definition is important. I agree with that. I have absolutely no problem with that. In fact, I would argue that as I go about the issue of causation, I really have to start with defining what's the problem. For me, the problem is a historical problem of a society which has been built on inter-ethnic conflict and animosity. Society which has been built by inter-ethnic conflict and animosity, which inter-ethnic conflict and animosity has spilled over into the political structures post 53. And so that the politics is now in itself a manifestation and a perpetuation of those animosities that were built by virtue of the manner in which we were settled and the economic relations that emerged along the way as we were settled, the coming of the various peoples, the role they played in the economy, and how people became grounded in particular positions vis-a-vis the others. And so if one is going to talk about the solution, I think that one has to look essentially in the first instance at the economic relations. I recognize that in social relations, that you have factors which are determining factors But from time to time, you can have factors which are dominant, though not determinant. And I think that to a large extent, our political system and political relations have become dominant. But they are not ultimately determining factors of our situation. And therefore, it will require the dominant political factor to accept what is the determinant and to address the determinant in an attempt to resolve the problem.
Let me be a little provocative here. As an Afro-Guyanese, and a proud one, some might argue, and indeed I would argue, that a major part of the problem is something you, Vincent, touched on. It's economic parity or economic empowerment. Now, I would argue that on that particular charge, our leadership, and when I say our, I'm speaking as an Afro-Guyanese, have failed us, and they have been woefully inadequate. And what I mean by that is this. We have run the country for 36 out of 56 years post-independence. We have had the Coffee 250. I was a founding member. The African Business Roundtable, IPADG, Globe Trust, and on, and you can, and now there's SAGE. We've had all these various organizations, and I'm curious to know, why haven't those organizations been effective in advancing this, what I call economic parity? And it seems like to me, as part of my self-reflection, we have to hold the leadership, our leadership, accountable. I think they have been missing in action. What say you?
Well, I would go back a little further than your reference to contemporary African Guyanese organizations, because if you're talking about leadership in some regards, the major finger could be pointed at the People's National Congress, which has benefited from majority support of African Guyanese. I think the problem is that in the past, we have not been brave enough, bold enough to accept and to place the problem on the table, and have attempted sometimes in what may be seen as clandestine manners, and I'm referring you to the political people, clandestine manners to resolve the problem in an environment where, unless you are able to unequivocally articulate what you're doing and why you're doing it from a very conscionable position, then you are going to be called to board for doing something that's unacceptable. And I think that has been a major part of the problem. I think that for all intents and purposes, that when Burnham introduced the cooperatives, I think he was sincerely searching for a way in which African Guyanese could assert themselves a role in the economy, because we are fundamental, but that it was not frontal. It was not frontal, and therefore, not being frontal did not provide the real opportunity, apart from the fact that the problem is twofold. The problem has its origin in the economic relations, but has become very dominant in the psychological sphere. And therefore, one has to come to grips with that dominant psychological sphere that is not in a position to impact the economic relations at this point in time. And I think that is one of the biggest problems we have, that nobody's accepting that over the historical period, what has happened psychologically to the African Guyanese has not been helpful in terms of the African Guyanese themselves addressing the problem. And every time one attempts to address this question, you're told that you're at fault. What have you done? I would say the African Guyanese psychological state is not simply of their own making, it's a part of the historical process. And therefore, in some regards, the state has to take responsibility and to provide the framework in which that problem could be resolved. And there are some very simple things. For example, the African Guyanese does not even have the kind of self-recognition that is required for him to lift himself sometimes out of the doldrums. And I'll give a very simple example of an experience I had. I drove to a gas station. I happened to have a Hilux Surf, and I drove to a gas station. And a little African Guyanese boy came to me and said, "You're driving Bossman vehicle." It means this little African Guyanese boy, where he is, does not accept in his mind that people of African descent are the ones who can own and control even a vehicle of that sort. And so he's resigned. He's young. This guy must be around 9, 10 years old. He's already resigned himself psychologically into a subordinate position in the society. And so, for example, in our school system, we are not taught Guyanese history in its depth. And so, on one hand, the African Guyanese is not led to believe where they came from and the role they've played. And at the same time, others are not given the basis for respect. So there's no mutual respect in that circumstance. So yes, I think that African Guyanese have to take some responsibility for where we're at, but that doesn't mean that they are at the point of initial cause of the problem. They're not. But I think we've been beaten into a psychological state that has created a complementarity between our economic status and our state of mind, which is not helpful.
Tim, what's your reaction to the exchange between Floyd and Alexander and Vincent?
Floyd asked a hard question.
Well, you're a senior.
Congratulations, Floyd.
You're a senior counsel, future presidential candidate, so you got to take the tough question.
Now, first, he's absolutely right. We have to identify the problem. And the first thing Vincent did was, I think, for me, identified one of the problems by distancing himself from a true statement that Floyd made. Floyd said, "You're a party." And Vincent's response was, "I don't have a party. I used to be a member of PNC Reform, and I am no longer a member of PNC Reform." Now, that fooled absolutely nobody who listened, because Vincent is as PNC as if it was stamped on his forehead, and everyone here knows it. So the first problem we have is that sideslip what is the truth, sideslip what is obvious to all of us. And I think that Floyd grasped that when he said, "My people see a problem." If we could just speak the truth, we would avoid a lot of unnecessary red herrings, a lot of unnecessary conversation. Cheddi Jagan spoke the truth in 1992, 1993, and got so much flack for it. Cheddi Jagan said, "Wealth in Guyana belongs to the Indians, that Indo-Guyanese hold the wealth in Guyana." And he was criticized for talking the truth. If we can't speak the truth, then we can't even have the conversation. We might as well be dogs barking and cats meowing, because we're wasting time even in having a conversation. So, to me, the first step is whether the truth is pretty or ugly. Speak the truth. The second thing, and this is where I think I saw, again, a difference between Floyd's approach and Vincent's approach. Sometimes you have to face your demons and peel back the layers of onion to see what's underneath. The little boy in the gas station is the emperor's new clothes. He spoke the truth. Because wealth in Guyana, for the most part, is in the hands of Indo-Guyanese, that little boy spoke what he saw as his truth. And I don't see that that little boy subjugated himself or accepted a role. He just peeled back the onion layers and spoke what he saw. That when you look on the road, most of the big vehicles are not owned by people like us. He just spoke his truth. But I don't think that we should ascribe to that little boy some sense of self-inferiority, some sense that he is less. Because if we do that, then we are contributing to the general perception that we are less. And I reject that. I reject that completely. Now, another truth I would like to throw out as a suggestion, and this I think is one of the problems that Vincent did identify, and maybe we have to talk about it, although I think his analysis of why the problem exists is completely wrong. Why is it that we only have 15-20% of the nation's wealth, although we represent 30-35% of the nation's population? Why is that? And I do not believe that there is some historical systematic advantage on one side or the other. As Floyd said, APNU ran this country for most of our independence. APNU took over when it was PNC, when we had plenty money, when we were one of the more developed countries. And when you look at the people who were put into positions of power and influence up until 1992, there was certainly favoritism, systemic favoritism, and yet it did not result in economic control. So we got to ask ourselves why. And for me, the reason why does not fall to any systemic preference. The reason lies elsewhere. I don't think it's one reason. I think it's several, but I would like to hear points of view.
Desmond, what is your reaction to the overall comments so far?
Thank you, Paul. Let me first say that I was actually disconnected for a minute or two, so I may have missed some of the discussion, but I have a general idea what the discussion was about. And it's a difficult question, but it's a key question that we have to deal with. The issue is we have several ethnic groups, two main ethnic minorities, mind you, because neither Indo-Guyanese or Afro-Guyanese make up more than 50% of the population. And we have other ethnic groups as well. We tend to forget about others because the whole of our politics is consumed by this Indo-Afro rivalry, when Indians and Africans make up less than 70% of the population as a whole. Now, as I said, it's a tough question. And first of all, the language, I'm wondering about the language used. For example, the idea that we have a society built on inter-ethnic conflict and animosity. I look at the news of the world, and you have inter-ethnic conflict that's reaching the stage of people killing one another. Really serious, and some of these ethnicities, you can't even tell the difference between them if some of the ethnicities are not even racial. You can have problems between Sunni Arabs and Shia from the same country. They're the same ethnicity in terms of race, so to speak, but they're just a different religion. You have ethnicities that vary by language.
The Hutus, the Tutsis is a very good example. Hutus and Tutsis, because they went.
Absolutely. There are many, many examples. Many examples. And my perspective is I think it's rather strong language to talk about ethnic conflict and animosity in this country. I do not experience that myself on a day-to-day basis, that level of problem. As a matter of fact, that there is a level of congeniality that I think is where we should be focusing our attention. That is our hope. That is our hope. That is what we can stand on instead of standing on conflict and because conflict happens everywhere. Conflict happens within families. It's part of life. But the fact is that we don't have to make that the guiding force for our own experience. However, having said that, there is the reality of disparities within the society, and the disparities show up in ethnic forms, right? And that is why it is a difficult question. And the answer to that is that we, in order to get to causes and diagnosis, we have to have a conversation. We have to ask people what bothers them. Where are your hurts? We have to ask ourselves, we have to have a dialogue about these questions. Because I can guarantee that if we sat down and had a genuine conflict across this country among people of different ethnicities and different sectoral differences, we're going to find out things that are going to shock us. We're going to find out things that are going to surprise us. It's going to happen. And therefore, that is where we have to be. Now, it's a difficult thing. This is something we have not done because I think it's almost as if we're comfortable with the idea of conflict. We need to try some form of dialogue, which is something that we have no history of doing. We have, in all the 60 years or whatever of this disagreements and so on, the simple thing to sit and address the conflict together, we really don't have experience of. And as a result of that, it means that if we're going to do that, we have to define a whole language. We have to define a whole set of protocols for conversation. If we're going to go into a room and talk, leave all guns at the gate, all right, whatever. We come inside, we don't use certain language. In other words, there has to be an element of goodwill, good intention. And all the good intentions we hear about have to be taken into that room, and we sit down and we have a chat. So it's a difficult question, and the fact of the matter is we do have disparities in the society, and we have to talk about them. But you know, the disparities are partly, people talk about division. I talk about diversity. The disparities and the differences are what make us who we are. The question is, how do we weld these disparities and these divisions into something productive and go forward? And bear in mind, my perspective is that the means, once we try, the means to get together and to move forward, the means exist. It's just a matter that we have to make our minds that we're going to do it, and not leave it just to politicians. This has to be something that we all are involved in. That's my view.
Desmond, under which president did you work as an economist?
I worked in the office of the president in 1982, so it was with President Burnham.
Wonderful. Did
I
Burnham,
actually
did Burnham
basically,
address the problem
I
of,
basically I was working with Carl Greenwich was at the
yeah,
time
yeah.
the
I'll come back.
economic advisor. Carl left, and I acted for
Okay.
the rest of the year.
I want to come back to you because I want to know a bit about to what extent Burnham addressed this issue, you as an economist, and dealing with the question of wealth disparity. Now, this is a very interesting conversation. Floyd, you want to ask any other question of the guests regarding this with the points that have been raised?
Just a follow-up comment. I totally agree with Timothy. I don't buy into the historical damage, historical scars argument. Listen, Afro-Guyanese leave Guyana, they go all over the world and they excel, and they do very well. They're hardworking, competent, patriotic people. I separate the African Guyanese people from their leaders. I think the leadership has failed them. And in order to get to the root of this, we're going to have to address it, put it front and center. The people look to leadership for protection, direction, and guidance. Perhaps we've offered some protection, and depending on who you talk to, maybe not. We certainly haven't offered direction, guidance. There is no plan. We are in the middle of an economy that's bursting at the seams. And where is the leadership? We're picketing to change the rules about gifts. That's what we're doing. I mean, this is, unless we begin to address the problems where we have failed us. As an Afro-Guyanese, I don't need anybody to help me. We have to do for ourselves. And until we accept that responsibility and put the blame squarely, I think, on the leadership, we can't even begin to address that problem. It is nobody's business to come and solve our problems.
I just want to raise 2 points. And one is, I don't like this broad sweep of a race analysis and not accompanying it with a class analysis. I did a study on poverty in Guyana for ActionAid International. The poorest people of Guyana live in the hinterland and the rural areas. The majority of the people in the rural areas are people of Indian descent. There are elites in Guyana of all ethnic groups, and they have hegemony in spheres, be it economic, cultural, political, social, military, etc. So I would strongly advise that we do not propagate untruths about an ethnic group. The Indo-Guyanese people are very, very poor in the rural areas. So are the Amerindian in there. And there are Afro-Guyanese in rural areas also, who are poorer than the Afro-Guyanese in Region 4, and so forth. So that's one point. The other point I want to raise, Vincent, is you speak about the psychological problem of the Afro-Guyanese. My brother, the Amerindians in conquest came through a horrible time. They also have psychological problems. The Indos, as you are aware, replaced the Afros in all those lodges and were treated really mercilessly on the plantation. They also have psychological problems. So the mixed groups in Guyana, they have a bigger psychological problem because they stand up and they look at the Indo and the Afro behaving like if they own the country, the elites, and they are left out. And they say, well, we are the real Guyanese because, you know, where are we going to trace our origin to? Only Guyana. So I agree with Desmond that we have to review the way the narratives and the vocabulary of the narratives. But I want to make a point about Burnham. Burnham, when he came, had two ideological thrusts. One was ethnic nationalism, and then at a point, he switched to Marxism-Leninism. Now, when he embraced ethnic nationalism at the time of the Cooperative Republic, he invoked Daly's book from the slave rebellion to the cooperativism and established intellectually a link between the Burbage Rebellion and cooperativism. Burnham pushed and thought that what he was doing was to empower Afro-Guyanese. And he did a lot of that. in pursuing ethnic nationalism, but it did not address the diversity of Guyana. Now, on the other hand, Jagan tried his best to ignore the race issue by embracing Marxism, Leninism for many, many years and emphasizing class and not sufficiently addressing, in my opinion, with the equal energy, the issue of race. So ideology is what we are talking about when we do a narrative, a historical narrative. But since I'm not the guest and the moderator, I would like to ask Desmond. Desmond, during the time you were an economist in Forbes Burnham's office, did he address this issue we're discussing from an economic point of view? Vincent spoke of the cooperatives. Beyond the cooperatives, was there any conversation, any dialogue among the leadership there in the president's office?
Yeah. Okay, well, as I said, I was in the office of the president from 81, about September, until 82, about September. I was there for 1 year exactly. And then I left to pursue further studies.
Okay.
And what I would say, what I remember of that time is that, if you recall, the preoccupations of that time were ideological rather than, it was a time, Guyana didn't have any right wing at the time. It was the PNC, the PP to the left, the WPA to the left, etc., etc. And you're right, Paul, that to a large extent the focus was on the kind of ideological class structure and so on. And the other thing about that time that I would suggest is that the fight, even though we had the internal battles around elections and so on, the preoccupations really were with the rest of the world. Guyana trying to be national, trying to develop and go its own way. Non-alignment was the cry, cooperatives and so on. Guyana was trying to go its own way in that respect. And although clearly there were issues of race in terms of the distribution of resources, for example, a big issue at the time was the fact that Guyana, the ban on flour and the ban on certain items, which appeared to have an ethnic dimension to it, or was interpreted in that way by some people. But to a large extent, the preoccupations were really about Guyana within that kind of Cold War context.
Okay.
Within the context of the non-aligned movement.
We're about to approach a break. Just before we go to the break, I want to point out that the period that we're talking about, the commanding heights of the economy, was not owned by any ethnic group in Guyana, but was owned by foreigners, whether it be bauxite, sugar, or whatever. So when we come back, we will shift the discussion away, but we will continue to monitor the model of President Ali that he's experimenting with from Monrepo to Fowles to see how that is progressing. And we wish him well, and we hope that it is successful so that Guyana could have a model that can be useful in the rest of the country. When we come back, we will shift our conversation to GECOM.
All From One Supplier is pleased to announce its online shipping for West Indian and American groceries. Order online at allfromonesupplier.com and with free shipping and deliveries to any part of the United States. Save time and energy to shop for all of your West Indian groceries from the safety of your home or office. We carry West Indian products like curry powders, meats and fish, dashing bush, pepper sauce, sodas, and your favorite snacks. All from One Supplier has it all. All from One Supplier fulfills and ships your order directly to you. So visit All from One Supplier today to start shopping, or call All from One Supplier at 718-551-3292 to handle all of your West Indian grocery needs. That's All from One Supplier, 718-551-3292. Free shipping, free deliveries, or curbside pickup from allfromonesupplier.com. Travelspan is now serving Guyana for over 26 years. They offer all airlines such as American, Eastern, Caribbean, and JetBlue. Guyana now has choices, so let Travelspan compare all airlines and offer you the best fare. And don't forget, Travelspan now has a shop, ship, and cargo division. So if you cannot travel, then shop and ship your items to Travelspan. Travelspan clears your items with customs and also has your items ready for pickup at any one of our offices in Georgetown, Berbice, or West Coast Demerara. Call Travelspan in New York at 718-845-0437, Georgetown at 227-1701, or Berbice at 337-4287. In New York, 718-845-0437, Georgetown 227-1701, or Berbice 337-4287, and West Coast Demerara at 269-0140. Let Travelspan book your flights or ship your items.
Welcome back to Globespan, and we had a very interesting discussion. But as you all would agree with me, we just touch a surface. This is a very important subject that we have to return to again and again and again until the Guyana nation state can become a country where we do not perceive ethnic uncertainties destabilizing the country at any point. So we will come back to the issue again, but now we'd like to shift to another controversial issue, and that is GECOM. So, Vincent, since you have had a lot of experience with GECOM, am I correct that you represent the PNC on GECOM? And can you give us an update? What is the status of GECOM since President Ali became the president of Guyana?
Paul, you have taken us back to the very first point I raised, that I represent the PNC at GECOM. One may see things from perspectives. Could be a formal perspective, could be a positive perspective, and various perspectives. I left the PNC in 2007, and it is public knowledge that I left because I was making a call for a new political culture.
True.
That's public knowledge. I don't know if Tim knows that. I have articulated views about Guyana that are not embraced by the PNC. I understand that people will see me as PNC. I understand that. But if one wants to be objective in terms of where I have stood ideationally and the reasons why I parted from the PNC, I cannot be accused of being untruthful when I say I'm not PNC. And so I come to the point that you just raised about me representing the PNC. You may also know that there was a point in time when the PNC leader called for me to resign from GECOM. And I did not resign because my position at the time was that GECOM is a constitutional body, and we are not really intended to be representatives. We are intended to be nominees who are sufficiently competent as to make decisions on behalf of Guyana. And I'm not saying that that is what it has turned out to be. But my position is that I do not represent. I'm not saying I wasn't listening to the PNC and see what their views are. I'm not saying that very often my positions might not coincide with the PNC, but I am not bound by the PNC in that constitutional office. Now, I want to just sidetrack away just a bit, I agree with Desmond that there is a need for a conversation. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever. Though I don't agree with much more of what he said. There's a need for a conversation. I disagree with Floyd and Timothy about the little African boy. Because whilst he might be speaking the truth in terms of who owns what, that truth that he lives impacts his psychological being and therefore may impact the way he sees himself, not just how he sees ownership of vehicles, but the way he sees himself, the possibilities for himself, the whole question of what is there in it for him. And so I think there's a psychological moment that we are ignoring in these discussions in relation to the African Guyanese. And that moment also comes to the point that you made, Paul. I agree that all of the ethnic groups have gone through various kinds of oppression and all of that, right? But I will argue that from the very inception, the way in which we came and the way in which we interact pitted us against each other, and that in that process, a hierarchical structure was built. One may argue today that the Amerindians are at the bottom of that structure. I don't have a quarrel with that. But the hierarchical structure was built based on, in the first instance, economic relations. And it is not true to say that you can equate the state of an African Guyanese during slavery and post-slavery with the state of an indentured Indian. We all suffered at the hands of the British. But the British in that sufferation also helped to create a hierarchy that pitted us against each other. And that has to be accepted. There's no equality in the treatment. Treatment differed. So I think we have to bear it in mind. The final point I want to make, and stealing your time, I agree that there is a class issue that has to be addressed. But I feel, and if one looks historically, one would see that in societies, the classes, the ruling class, so to speak, that takes a hold of things, uses the tribe to protect itself and to cordon off itself. So yes, I would agree that there is a problem, fundamentally a class problem, but that in our circumstance and in other circumstances with the ethnic configurations, one has to cross the ethnic hurdle before one can cross the class hurdle. And I think the unique example of this is the South African situation. They have been able, in a sense, to cross the ethnic hurdle, and now they have to confront the class hurdle, and the class hurdle is within the tribe to a very large extent.
So can we move on to GECOM? And
yes, we'll get to leave in just one last second.
Listen, you definitely have to be in the conversation because you are one of what I call, and you might be upset with my categorization, black nationalist leaders in Guyana who is very vociferous. So we should come back and have a very good discussion with the various ethnic nationalists and the Guyanese nationalists, which I am in that category, and we continue on this discussion. But however you would like to define yourself, you were put into GECOM in an agreement between political parties that the PPP will have so many representatives, then the AP and UFC have so many, and you were there. So what I'm asking you now as a commissioner, what is the present situation in GECOM in light of all that happened in the 2020 election? Are there reforms being carried out? What is going on? We want you to give us.
I would say that if one looks at GECOM today, in some regard, GECOM is comatose. There is no real movement in GECOM. All that is being said about GECOM is originating from outside of GECOM. We started on a process of preparation for the local government elections, and in some regards, after there were requests for conversations with political parties, I would say that we have kind of halted and are looking to see what the parties have to say and what they have to do. And there is no real action in GECOM at this point in time. So we really can't predict in some regards where we're going, but we know that GECOM is an environment where parties are lining up in positions. And so, for example, the People's Progressive Party is saying that they have no problem with the list. This is not the problem. The personnel in GECOM is the problem, and we can have elections with the same list, but change the personnel. We know that the APNU AFC is saying the list is the problem, and we shouldn't go anywhere unless we address the question of the list. So that there is a significant standoff out there that has, in a sense, brought GECOM to a halt. And this takes us back to the point that Desmond made. There has been no conversation about the problems of GECOM. And in my view, given the import of GECOM, we're going to continue to have a problem unless we can get to the point where we agree that there's a need for a conversation and a consensus about GECOM. In some regards, in the past, there's been some conversations. Where we got to in 91, 92 came out of a conversation with some changes. Where we got to in 2001 came out of a conversation with some changes. But unfortunately, at this point in time, there's no conversation.
So, Timothy, you have been involved in the 2020 elections and had issues with GECOM. What is your party's position now about the status of GECOM and the upcoming local government election?
Well, I'm sorry you moved away from the discussion about economics and ethnic control of economics. You were dismissive of a true statement that Vincent made. And I think that if I allow that to go, I will be complicit in adding to the problem. I talked about speaking the truth. And when Vincent talked about the disparity in wealth, and I agreed with the disparity in wealth, you, to my surprise, didn't validate that or acknowledge its truth. You made a totally irrelevant comment about poor people living in rural areas. And by dismissing the very fundamental and central concept that we're talking about, where the wealth is held, you then blithely went on and changed the subject. Well, the fact that you got poor people living in the rural areas does not change the fact that when you look at where the wealth is, for the most part, it's in one location. And if you sidestep a truth like that, you are adding to the problem.
Oh, I don't agree with you, Timothy. I think you
All right, but I'm going to finish anyway. If you look at privately owned hospitals in Georgetown.
What data do you have about the poverty in Guyana? Are you saying that the Indians are not the majority in the rural area of Guyana and that they are among the poorest? Yes or no?
Good. Now, if we are asking the question, who holds the wealth? Do you answer that question by identifying who is the poorest?
When you posit the question and you say that the Indians own the wealth, that is not totally true. We have the bauxite industry, we have the sugar industry, we have the timber industry, and the state controls it. Now, it is true that there is a rich Indian economic elite. Everybody knows that. Nobody is denying that. But also, Afro-Guyanese has hegemony in the military, in the civil service, and in the police force. So when you speak about the elite reality, it's very different when you speak for the masses of Guyanese. And that has to go with regions also. In Region 4, most of the resources are there. And look at the population in Region 4 compared with the other regions. So I think, Timothy, you have to make a more complex, a more strongly analytical and data-driven analysis about the wealth and distribution of wealth. And you have to focus on the role of the elites, the economic elites, the social, the political.
I will do so, Paul, as soon as you let me get a word in as moderator.
Go ahead.
Thank you. If you look at the locally owned banks in Guyana, GBTI and them are our bank. If you look at the locally owned private hospitals in Guyana, Prashad, Balwant Singh, Anamaya's Hospital. If you look at the big names of industry in Guyana, Kapoor, Tulsi Prasad, Boyer, can you give me any comparative? Because what you have done is you have said one side doesn't hold wealth because look, two poor people living in a rural area there. And that is the worst red herring and the most obvious red herring I've heard in a long time.
You have to be.
You're not going to let me get a word in.
No, I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is that do not say that the Indians, say the Indian elite, because the majority of Indians do not own that wealth. The majority of Indians are not Tulsi Prasad. The majority of Indians is not DDL and these people. The majority of Indians are poor people. And therefore,
if I could
the majority of Afros are poor also. So there is a class and an economic elite that controls wealth in that country.
If I could just say a word.
I'm not denying that.
If I could just say a word. I made the point earlier of the relationship between class and ethnicity, where I made the point that, yes, there is a class issue, but very often the people of one ethnic group tend to congregate around the class, the people in their ethnic group who are of the upper class. So the struggle, in a sense, becomes an ethnic struggle. But because even those poor people you're talking about do not distance themselves, class is a very objective phenomenon. Class is a very objective phenomenon and does not necessarily psychologically position people in a class perspective in the struggle. They sometimes, even with the class situation, take an ethnic perspective. And it's in that regard, one has to contextualize what Timothy is saying.
I'm not ignoring that it has its complexity, but all I'm saying, do not tell me all Indians are rich, because that is not so. It's an Indian elite. And don't tell me Afro-Guyanese elite in various spheres in the professions and so forth, that all Afro-Guyanese are okay. And look at the regions, the disparities and so forth. So I am saying that if the conversation is going to be real, we have to work with data. There is no data about the ethnic breakdown on wealth in Guyana. That is one of the fundamental problems we have in the country, that we are working with stereotypes that come down from British colonialism of perceptions of various ethnic groups. Anyhow, so we'll come.
You were kind enough. You were kind enough to let me start with 3 words, and then you interrupted as a moderator, and you didn't let me finish the analysis I was making.
Go ahead.
And then you changed the goalpost. There isn't anyone in this forum yet who has said all Indo-Guyanese are wealthy, and yet that's what you just suggested. Don't tell me all Indo-Guyanese are wealthy. No one has suggested that.
Indians have
wealth. Paul, you are interrupting again.
Yeah, let him finish.
I'm correct.
Paul, you're interrupting again.
Okay.
Can I finish, or should I be quiet? I can be quiet. I'm very good at it.
Go ahead.
Thank you. To finish the point that I was making, and the question was, which ethnic group holds more wealth? That is the question that was asked. Not if all are rich and all are poor. And to finish the analysis I was making, if you look at land ownership, valuable agricultural land ownership in Ghana, you think of names of Cayman Sankar and Gadrupi. There's no parallel equivalent on the other side. So I've identified financial institutions to you. I've identified commerce and business to you. I've identified private ownership such as hospitals, and I've identified land ownership. Now, those are the largest areas that we can identify in terms of what has happened in independence in Guyana. And therefore, it vindicates the premise that Vincent started on, which is a truthful premise and needs to be discussed. It should not be disparagingly dismissed. We have to accept the truth and ask ourselves, why is this the truth? What has caused this? But we shouldn't just dismiss it and pretend it's not happening.
I
Now,
disagree with that. All I'm saying, don't say all Indians are rich. That's all.
Can I jump in here,
Go ahead.
Paul? I think that this issue is a critical issue. On one side, I think it's important for us to actually, you say where are the data? I think we do need very in-depth study because we're dealing here with perceptions. Whether they're true or not, we're dealing with perceptions. But the fact is that the perceptions are very important because at the heart of the ethnic problems are what are being referred to as ethnic insecurities. And this has been studied by a number of people. All right. The fact of the matter is, whether we, the fact of the matter is that there are the ethnic insecurities related to the fact that to the conspicuous signs of Indian wealth as against, say, Afro-Guyanese wealth. So these things create problems. The other side of it is that people, if you look at the pattern of say, employment, the pattern of employment really is one that intertwines people of different ethnicities. If you go into any of these enterprises, the ones that Tim has been talking about, for example, in other words, this situation is a complex one. And in this country, we need to study these things in detail so that, because having the knowledge will help us to deal with the problems. But the fact of the matter is that these perceptions are related to the ethnic insecurities that fuel the divisions and the problems that we have. So we can't get away, we can't ignore them, we can't get away from them. We need to address the insecurities, we need the information, but the fact of the matter is that these insecurities are part of our reality. I have to be that.
Let me just say, let me jump in. I think Timothy is absolutely correct. Listen, the fact that Indians control a large majority of the wealth and dominate the economic landscape is fact. I come at it from a slightly different standpoint. My question is, what are we going to do about it? And what I'm arguing is that when we have had the chance to try to bridge that gap or level that playing field, our leadership, I keep going back to this, that nobody wants to explain it. Our leadership has squandered that opportunity. They've blown it. They're blowing it currently as we speak. And I haven't heard anybody address that. I am arguing that part of that problem, not all of it, some of the psychological and the historical and those types of things, there is some legitimacy there. But a big part of the problem is failed leadership. I think I will go further. I think Black leadership has betrayed the Black masses.
Well, I wonder if I could suggest two causes, and I'd like the reaction, these gentlemen. Now, first of all, Dr. Thomas, thank you for what you said. I entirely agree with what you said. I reject what Vincent said about some kind of legacy from 200 years ago making me feel inferior. 2 generations ago, my family were illiterate, but I have never felt inferior. And the generation before me didn't feel inferior. And I don't believe that there's any psychological damage that I inherited, except from the oppression under the Burnham years and in independence, because that's what I experienced. But I do think that you tend to take the role, take the job, take the function that your parents had. Teachers tend to have children who become teachers. Professionals have children who become professionals. And one thing I did notice is that under Burnham, the public service was populated with PNC supporters. Beginning in 1960s and 70s at the time, when it was dignified and middle class to be a teacher, when your income was all right. When if you were a professional in the public service, because under the British, to work in the public service, you could buy yourself a house and pay a mortgage and go on a holiday every year. But because he allowed the economy to crumble and the currency to devalue, those people and their children doing the same job suddenly became poor and destitute. So that a teacher in 1984 was struggling, whereas that teacher's parent in 1964 was quite comfortable. And I think that that may be one aspect of a systemic, a situation where we are placed in a system that taking on the job that you're automatically going to, unless you break the mold, may help put you in a worse position, even though you're doing the same job that your father did. And I think the second thing might be the family structure. When I look at the communities in Guyana, the Afro-Guyanese who are successful, and they tend to be more professional rather than business. I already gave my theory why. They come from intact families. They come from families where they have a role model. They have a father in the house. And to my mind, it is much easier for an average child to grow up successfully in a nuclear, solid, stable, reliable household than it is for an average child who grows up with just mommy or just grandma or just auntie. You have to be exceptional to rise above the background of a broken family and all the trappings and problems that come with that. And those are 2 theories I just want to throw out, and perhaps there are comments on them. But I wonder if maybe there may be 2 factors that affect what, to me, is the truth, that the economic wealth is in the hands of one, not the other.
Well, what we'll do is we have about 2 minutes more before we go for the break, but we wouldn't have time to discuss GECOM and local government elections. So we'll continue this discussion about national healing. So we have only about 1 minute more to go before we take the break. And then when we come back, we will continue the discussion. And I think Timothy has posited 2 approaches that one has to consider in looking at the wealth disparity. I still keep insisting that it's not a good idea to say all Indians are rich, because when there are racial conflicts, they attack the poor Indians. And I will continue to say that we have to have data, so that I agree that there are elite Indians who are very wealthy. I agree with that. But I do not like that broad sweeping broom that is probably because I'm a person from the grassroots and labor oriented. And I do think about, and I've lived and traveled through that country and saw the poverty of the Indo-Guyanese poor people in the rural areas. And so I am very aware of what I'm talking about from a real point of view. So we'll take a break and come back, and
Paul, can I?
That's not, it's 8:15. We have to take a break.
You take a break now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cannot travel due to COVID? Then treat yourself or your loved one with a gift. Purchase it online, then let Travelspan Shop and Ship take care of the rest. Travelspan is now offering a shop and ship program to Guyana and Trinidad. cheap rates plus tracking, and multiple offices in Georgetown, West Coast Demerara, and Berbice to take care of your package. Treat yourself and ship your Christmas gifts early this year. In Guyana, 227-1701, and in New York, call 347-238-2201. That's 227-1701. And in New York, 347-238-2201. Let Travelspan and Globespan take care of your online shopping and shipping. Globespan 24/7 is serving the community for over 2 years. We hope that the programs have been of value to you as we continue to connect with the issues and politics that matter to you. Support Globespan 24/7 initiatives by logging on to globespan247.com. Click on Globespan 24/7 talk shows and make a contribution. Your contribution will help to build a better platform for the communities. On Globespan 24/7, you can also download the player for Roku TVs, Samsung TVs, and Android TV boxes. You could also download the Globespan 24/7 channel on your Android mobile phone. Support Globespan 24/7 and also support the companies that support Globespan, such as Travelspan and allfromonesupplier.com. Allfromonesupplier.com is promoting Gaisuku sugar as a way to support Guyana sugar industry. Purchase your Gaisuku sugar from allfromonesupplier.com along with your West Indian and American groceries. Purchasing Gaisuku sugar is a good fate gesture to help restore the sugar industry. Allfromonesupplier.com has free shipping and delivery, and we ship to all states and free deliveries in New York. Log on to allfromonesupplier.com or call 718-551-3292. That's allfromonesupplier.com or 718-551-3292.
Desmond, are you there?
Yes, yes, I am.
You have the floor.
Yes, yeah. Well, I just wanted to mention, to make the point that, Timothy just mentioned a couple of factors that he thinks are important. And the importance of that is that what we're trying to deal with here in a few minutes is very complex. And he mentions a couple of factors. There are others, all right? One of them, for example, is exactly where different groups are positioned in the society. So, for example, as he mentioned, there was a time when Afro-Guyanese were proud holders in the civil service, the teaching professions, the police, etc., etc. And it worked for them for a while. But the thing is, when the economy started to crumble, when, for example, we got into problems of stability and you had high inflation and so on, devaluation and so on, being in that position turned out to be made them more vulnerable. So the matter is very complex. We can add others, right? The fact of the matter is we're dealing here with complexity. And we cannot, the danger is to have narratives that are very simple and very quick for things that are really very, very complex. And that is why I come back to the issue of dialogue. The way for us to deal with these kinds of things is precisely what we're doing now. It's a good thing. Whether we may disagree, and so on. But the fact of the matter is, we express different views, and out of this can come a better understanding. And that's the direction that we have to go in. All right, because the matters we're dealing with are very complex. I'm not, I have a problem with the kind of sense of going back to slavery and so on as the explanation for what was happening. Of course, slavery was a problem, and there were negatives associated with it. We can't deny that. But I have a problem with this sense that it then creates this sense among us that we're victims. And, you will not fix your problems with a victim mentality. Never. And so there are lots of changes that have to come about, and we have to talk it through, we have to connect, and we have to get past them. And it's complex. We have to study, we have to talk about it.
So, what kind of recommendations currently, as we are now, would, in light of where Guyana is at right now, would you all make concretely? Because the issue of wealth disparity is not only an issue in Guyana. Right here in America, it's the biggest issue right now. The biggest issue right now. And so I'd like to hear what your opinions are regarding how do we deal with the question of wealth disparity. How does one deal with that? What kind of policies would have to be implemented to address it?
If I may enter here, I don't think we can go directly to the question of wealth disparity. I think we have to go to the question of what we have to have the conversation. Let me say that. I agree totally with Desmond. We have a conversation. And the conversation has to allow us to define the problem, determine the cause of the problem, and it's in that process you may find that a part of the resolution of the problem is how we deal with the disparity in wealth. I wouldn't go start off the conversation about let's deal with the disparity in wealth. I started the conversation by saying, here, we need a conversation. We need to see what has caused our problem. We need to define that problem. And then we have to look for solutions. And the solutions may well be solutions in terms of our economic structures, solutions in terms of our social structures, but these have to come out of a conversation where when we put forward those solutions, they are more or less accepted based on what came out of the conversation. Without that, attempting to put forward solutions may just be another source of conflict.
So we have about 7 minutes. So I'd like to ask each of the others if they could make a reflection or a comment regarding the national healing process in Guyana, which is linked with all the issues that have been raised. And in the next program, we'll deal with GECOM and local government. Timothy, you want to give it a shot?
Vincent started the conversation by saying that the ethnic conflict fed the political divide. And Desmond criticized that approach, and in fact criticized any discussion of ethnic conflict. He pointed out, correctly in my view, that in Guyana, we don't have a conflict. We get along for the most part. And there are other places where there is a conflict. If you look at the amount of mixed race people in Guyana now, I think that's testament to the fact we're getting along quite well. What I think is the truth in Guyana is that it is the exact reverse of what Vincent said. It is not that the ethnic animosity feeds into the politics. It is that the political structure that has two ethnic-based parties creates the cycle of ethnic mutual distrust and conflict. Because that ethnic loyalty is the only reason that I will reject Vincent's contention every time that he is not a PNC supporter, unless he can tell me that he voted PPP in 2020. So there is a blind ethnic loyalty because there are two ethnic-based parties, and that creates the conflict, not the other way around. And until there are enough Guyanese to reject the fact of an ethnic party, to recognize that an ethnic party per se is the problem, and therefore to reject whichever side of the fence they're on, we will continue to have our problem.
Floyd, you
Yeah.
To give it a shot.
Yeah, I think this is where I agree with Vincent. I don't think there is any magic bullet. There is no secret sauce. What has to happen is that, and I go back to my leadership. The leadership have to be able to go to the people and get the people to face their challenges. You know, you tend to define a problem in light of the values the people hold. And our leadership has to be able to go to the people, get us to examine the issues that are causing these challenges, and then come up with solutions to bring us along. I don't think anybody's going to do that for us. I think we have to do that for ourselves. So I think it starts with the right kind of leadership who can engage the people, get them to face their challenges, and then bring them along. And then finally, I think the leadership needs to come up with a plan, some kind of a vision. And Desmond is also absolutely right. What he's talking about is what we call adaptive leadership. You cannot solve people's problem without engaging the people themselves. In fact, they become part of the solution. When we try to prescribe solutions from up on high, it's never going to work because Desmond is 100% right. You may be surprised when you go and talk to people. As we found out in our listening interviews, some of their answers may shock you. And unless you get to that level where you're listening to people, understanding the issues, we cannot sit here in a room and come up with solutions.
Vincent, do you want a last word, but a quick last word, and then Desmond a quick last word? Yeah.
I really think that the conversation is necessary, that we have a plethora of views, but that the starting point has got to be an earnest and honest conversation, bottom up, that seeks to tell us where we're at, that seeks to tell us where we want to go, and that eventually tells us how we get to where we want to go. I think that is critical. And in all of that, I think the framework, we have to understand that in the final analysis, economics are a determinant, that there are other elements that may be dominant at a particular point in time, and we have to use the dominant element at any particular point in time to impact the entire process, even though finally impact has to be on the economy, which is the determining factor in the final analysis.
Okay. Desmond, you have just 1 minute.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Paul. Thanks to everybody else. Really, I think this has been a useful discussion, and we need a lot more time to some of these issues. But just let me make one correction. I didn't. It's not that I think that we don't have ethnic differences or ethnic problems. I mean, is that? But life is. My approach is that life has its problems, and we just have to have a positive outlook in terms of addressing the problems. But what I would say, and I really appreciate the point made by Tim along these lines. It's not that our ethnic problems are the causes of our political problems. It's the other way around. We have political systems and we have a whole institutional setup, including, for example, GECOM, how GECOM is set up. We have institutional set of problems that create deadlock, that create conflict, that create, and my position is these things can be changed. We just have to make a big enough effort. They can be changed. And the worst part of it is the emphasis on the ethnic problem. You look, if you're Indian or you're African, you can't change that. So if we have ethnic conflict, you get the sense then that it cannot be changed because these people, because of this racial problem.
Well, we have
that is where we have to change that, and that is why as you know, I'm a member of the electoral reform group. We feel that it can be changed, and the place to start is with the electoral reform. If we can get that through,
And that's a very good note. That's a very good note to end, which is positive. I do, however, believe that as we move forward I believe in dialogue. I believe in a liberal democratic system. I'm a nationalist, anti-racist, fundamentally committed to democracy. So dialogue is key. But I think we need a narrative, a consensus narrative about our history. And this has not been done. And we have to engage in this discussion. But any dialogue that is not driven by data is going to create a lot of stereotypes. And we do not have data in Guyana that has been put together about many aspects of Guyanese existence, and that will help as we work towards an interpretation of history and a presentation so that every child at school could have at least one understanding about the evolution of our country, some kind of consensus. It does not necessarily have to be, a repetition of a rote, but it has to be done, and that is absent in Guyana. Because you speak to each Guyanese, they give you a stereotype understanding about history. So, gentlemen, thank you very much. This has been an extremely interesting conversation. We'll have to come back the next time to deal with GECOM and local government, and I hope you guys will come back again. So, until next time, I'm Paul Hennessy for Globespan.
Thank you, Jeff.